The idea is, and I'm going to tell you, just this morning, listening to Fox News, there were two different segments on education. And part of it, of course, is Terry McAuliffe, the gubernatorial candidate in Virginia, who made the statements parents shouldn't be involved in schools. And this was in respect of a demonstration outside a school board meeting where some of the parents were throwing rocks at and screaming at school board members. And the issue then, we're going to talk about two sets of issues today. And I don't have a lot of slides. I tried, by the way, I hope you all noticed that the number of articles was just 3. And they began with 2 conservative articles. And the third one was a very moderate leftist article. It's not even leftist enough to be called moderate. Anyway, I'm trying to adapt to the crowd, fit the pattern. There are 2 categories of issues. Some are activities, some are content. The activity issues are frankly those that caused the greatest uproar around school board meetings. And they were vaccine mandates, mask mandates, less this time, but we've seen in the last several months, heterosexual bathrooms and heterosexual sports issues. And those 4 activities have been part of the big fight over the last several months, and that's the national COVID fight. I listened to a bit on Fox again this morning, a police officer in Chicago being interviewed about the mayor's mandating masks for police officers. And the guys representing one of the police unions said only 50% of policemen in Chicago are vaccinated. And it was his view that that was about the level it will remain. That in the most violent city in the United States, it seems odd to him that 50% of the policemen would be forced to leave because they didn't take the shot. So the issue is alive and well and difficult. But underneath those issues are the content issues. And let's start there, it's all right. And I just put down 4, and I think these are kind of the 4 biggest content issues. And we'll talk about each one at a time. The first having to do with the issue, how do you teach slavery and teach about slavery? And that, of course, has the hot flash issue of critical race theory. We'll come back to it. How do you teach American history? Is our history a benign, wonderful, glorious history without blemish? Or are there some blemishes that we've prevailed against and survived? How do you teach faith? And how much faith should there be in the schools? I'm surprised that this is still an issue. But just this morning, I listened to people talking about their, again on Fox, their Christian book, and they pointed out this is not about it's not a holiday book, it's a Christian book with emphasis on the exclusivity, frankly, of Christianity. And believe it or not, still today, there are schools where teaching evolution is either banned or frowned upon. And that's been an issue since the Scopes trial. So going back to the top, and let's join in. Neil asked that I talk a little bit, just describe what I understand critical race theory to be. And I've done a lot of reading about it, and what it seems to me there's, in general use, I think critical race theory is talking about race or talking about slavery. That is not what CRT is. Critical race theory is a legal concept or approach that was introduced about 40 years ago sadly by a man who taught at Harvard, but the man could easily have taught at Flagler, but sadly taught at Harvard, and that puts a slight tilt on critical race theory. What he said was, as taught at the law school at Harvard, to be critical of a particular issue, what you do was look into the law and practice and see whether that issue had or continues to have an impact. Critical race theory says, how much of an impact does race have in our laws? And a critical race theory class would typically begin by looking at legislation over the last 50 or 100 years, for however many years it is, or look at how that legislation is implemented. Legislation like, right up through the 1965 Civil Rights Act, and in some communities to this day, housing in some neighborhoods is only available to whites. Housing loans, financing for housing in red-lined areas is not available to people within those red lines, and those red lines define black neighborhoods. Highways are built when the interstate highway system was implemented during the 50s. When a highway would come through a town, surprise, surprise, it kind of ran right between the black neighborhoods and the white neighborhoods, separating them, okay? CRT says, what impact do those practices and or laws have on our society? That's all it is. And the students of CRT look at tons and tons and tons of legislation, which I guarantee you our elementary students are not looking at. Very few college students are looking at it. It's more of a law school curriculum. The short form of CRT is to talk about racism and to talk about slavery. Does that make any sense? Comments, questions? So when we see people saying that there should not be a continuation of CRT being taught in our schools, what does that mean? What schools are people talking about?
I have a story. My father was killed when I was 9.
Can't hear you.
It's in this
There you
on?
go.
Yeah. My father was killed when I was 9. And when I was 10, I was home from school in the afternoon, and the doorbell rang. And I went out of my room, over the balcony. I could see a beautiful black man at the door. And he said, can I come in and talk to you about your husband, who I knew in Africa? He was a beautiful black man. And my mother, I wanted to hear his story so much, but my mother said, no, thank you for coming, but I can't let you in. And she said she was sorry. But I never spoke to my mother about that, but I sure was happy and grateful that she never told my schools what to teach. So I ended up with a very egalitarian curriculum.
So,
Critical race theory.
wait.
Oh, be careful.
Thank you. Critical race theory is not taught below the college level. This is a specious issue brought up for political impact. It's stupid. It's not an anti-white bias. It's a specious issue. I don't know why people are all upset about it.
Charlie?
Talking about me. I just first a question and then I make a statement. Sue, where did you get your information from?
I've read lots of stuff
What stuff have you read?
online.
Online?
There's one high school that teaches critical race theory. It certainly isn't taught below.
Well, why? Okay, thank you. Why are all of the mothers now getting upset
because
across the country?
Okay,
This is what's going on.
we'll come to that. And I have a lot of information on that here, so that backs up what you're saying. Please distinguish, and this is the thing that's so hard to do in a conversation generally, but certainly with all the news. distinguish between CRT, the teaching of critical race theory, which is really a post-college program, distinguish between that, and I'm going to use another acronym, DET, Diversity, Equity, Training. And diversity and equity training is going on, and I'm going to talk about that, but right here in Florida and some of the implications of that, it's not CRT. So when we argue this is a red herring CRT, what we should be saying is the wrong title for something that is an issue. And that issue is, how do we teach diversity in our schools? Does that make any sense?
Okay, being that the major subject here is education, which I had influence, we talked about it.
Exactly.
So my question really is, first I ask the question, are there any teachers in the room, people here who have a background in teaching?
Jenny.
1, 2,
Jenny Veal.
3,
3 or 4.
4. Did you teach, well, first of all, did you teach diversity and equity and those issues in your classrooms when you taught? And I'm going to say probably not, because it's such a relatively new thing. Please.
Because I've been retired over 20 years, and I was in an unusual situation right over here. And that's just kind of a different from the usual school.
What school were you at? I'm sorry.
Palm Valley.
Oddly enough, there are curriculum. Let me just go down. I have below 3 different curricula that are on offer right here in Florida, and an interesting discussion about it. Our speakers over the next month are going to include people very, very qualified to talk about it. Gary Chartrand was chairman of the State Board of Education, appointed by Scott and continued under DeSantis. He was on the board for 8 years, chairman for 2 years. He's speaking November 5th. I think that's 3 weeks. Next week, thanks to Nancy Pearson, we're going to have a preschool teacher talking to us about the educational format. In response to this issue, and in preparation for this issue, I've done a lot of research, and I'll talk about some of that later. But last night we met with Catherine Payton, had dinner with Catherine Payton, the wife of the former Mayor John Payton. And I mentioned that we were doing education and educational content today, thinking this was just, it would stop there. She said, well, I'm on the board at Bowles. And then went in to talk about she talked about 2 different educational programs. Do any of you know about Pollyanna curriculum?
I just heard that they were having a flat at Bowles about Pollyanna.
Go ahead, say it again. Say it again in the mic.
Pollyanna, I just heard at Bowles they were having a flat among their students. And
It was actually
about the subject.
It was banned at Bowles. But Pollyanna, I think of Pollyanna as kind of unrealistic happiness or good news, or an attitude about things that puts a good news gloss on them. So I was surprised to hear that Pollyanna is a diversity curriculum that was started by, let me show you what the slide says about it. This is a view from someone at Bowles. It's just one of many left-wing groups working to carry out what critics describe as far-left, anti-American indoctrination. Forrest.
Wait a minute, Forrest.
I better behave, huh?
You better, this is one.
She said I can speak twice. My son Mark is on the Bowles board also,
Okay.
and I didn't hear it as a Pollyanna diversity training. I heard it as diversity training. And as I understood it, the director of diversity training at Bowles on the main campus on San Jose wanted to appoint 3 other diversity officers in the various campuses, including the one around the city. Well, the cost of doing that is somewhat absurd compared to the issue, because you've got swimmers from all over the world occupying most of the 60 beds at Bowles. And you also have a diverse staff, you've got diverse professors or teachers, and you've also got the coaching staff has a good bit of diversity, as well as the players in the various sports. And it was voted down by the board because they felt like they were making enough of an effort there. They had a diverse campus. And it wasn't a matter of thinking diversity is bad. It was a matter of we have diversity, we have a diversity officer, and that's reasonable cause. But to do it for 4 campuses was unnecessary.
I think that's a good explanation of the controversy. The problems were severalfold. Part was cost, and what's the need? And then the question of what is the need for diversity training in Bowles or anywhere else? And if you determine that there is a need, how do you teach it? And what is being taught? What are the curricula available? The Pollyanna curriculum included, at least in one segment, and I have that curriculum printed out, and maybe I'll include that in the next 1,000-page distribution. And I'll limit it to just CRT. But in one of the segments of the Pollyanna curriculum, students are separated into black and white, and in some responses colored and white, and they talk about their grievances, and then they come together. And one of the objections of the board was, we don't want our students separated, which emphasizes the separation. Interestingly enough, the Bowles board and the Douglas Anderson boards both blocked diversity training of that type, Pollyanna's training, in March. And the state law banning CRT, again, there's this confusion of words. Are they banning the technical CRT taught in law schools and postgrad law schools? Law schools, or are they banning diversity training, which is, frankly, quite a different thing? The board at Bowles is now looking at FAIR. I don't know if Mark's talked to you about that for us, but FAIR is, and it's Fair for All is the full name. You can Google Fair for All, as well as Googling Pollyanna. Fair for All is a different curriculum for diversity. And its guiding principle I printed out here. Even our children's schools are enforcing a cynical and intolerant orthodoxy that requires us to identify ourselves and each other based on immutable characteristics like skin color, gender, and sexual orientation. It pits us against one another and diminishes what it means to be human. And so, these are the 3 key elements of the FAIR training. By the way, Pollyanna, in response to being blocked at Bowles, it's the most frequently used diversity training in the Northeast, but it has an answer to these criticisms, and I'll come back to that. I won't read all of this here, you can all read it as easily as I can, but you'll see that this Fair for All diversity training goes back to a concept that, to several concepts that say, recognizing differences based on skin color and or sexual orientation and or ethnic origin is a false way to teach because it puts us against each other as opposed to bringing us together. The black students at Bowles, and I didn't put their comments in here, but the black students at Bowles are very much upset by the banning of the Pollyanna teaching, and they are saying, and I don't know if there are 3 of them, or if you're right for us, there may be 50 of them. They're saying it's all right for you guys to use the N-word in our sports teams from our coaches and from our fellow students, but it's not all right to talk about racism and slavery. And if you say, yo, N-word, when I'm sitting down for lunch, I think maybe we should talk. Now, to me, that sounds like a reasonable request. And one of the things I think, and this would be I don't know what the appropriate budget is to teach diversity. I'm not going to pretend that it should be 4 people in the Bowles system or 1 or none. I would say none. I think if you talk to students, especially black students, and their personal experience is that there is still a great deal of discrimination and a great deal of anti-immutable characteristic, then maybe it is worthwhile to spend some time talking about it. Charlotte? By the way, I don't want to be talking too much. Please contribute.
The comment, two comments. Number one, when I was in the service for a couple of years out of Oklahoma, my battalion probably was about half black. And as far as the N-word was called, because I never heard it used by any of the white people in my outfit, but I sure heard a lot of the N people using that word among themselves. And I think it was more a joke in a way, but that's been my experience with the N-word. The other comment I have really is a question. Who determines what the curriculum is going to be? Are teachers told this is what you're to teach, or do teachers have the option to teach it in the way that they want? It seems to me that whoever is responsible for the curriculum has a very powerful position. But I don't know who develops the curriculum.
Sue?
I have a partial answer to that. Once in my career, I worked for an educational publisher, helped to write a math textbook series for kindergarten through 8th grade. This was in the early 70s, where we were very conscious of representing minorities, blacks, in our series, in pictures, in jobs of responsibility, doctors, lawyers, whatever. And when we had pictures of little kids, we made sure that we represented minorities in those pictures. Well, it came time for the State Board of Education in Texas to go through their however many yearly adoption of textbooks. I was sent to Texas to defend our representation of minorities in our textbook. And our textbook was rejected because it was too liberal. They didn't want pictures of blacks as doctors and lawyers and whatever. Whereas most of the places that were adopting textbooks demanded that we show minorities in equal or equitable positions. So that's a partial answer.
That's the 70. Carol?
I don't know that this is important, but I just wondered if you from the north know what blacks use as a derogatory term for us that's the equivalent to the N-word.
What is it?
Honky.
Yeah.
I can't hear
And maybe white students who are offended by being called honkies would also like to talk about diversity training. Forrest, again, and you're now moving into the limitation on your comments, so.
You asked for this.
No, wait.
No, I love
You said, please participate.
This is true.
I think we could save a lot of running if we would get Forrest and Charles sitting next to each other.
Oh, my God. Come over here close to me.
I'll sit next to you.
I think the bigger issue of this whole stuff about separation of people into different groups, male, female, white, black, Yankee, Southerner, green, purple, yellow, whatever the hell you want to do. I mean, I think it's absolutely insane. I remember when I was a kid, and there was some black oppression in the South. I'm a child of the South. I've lived in 6 southern states. I know all about what racism looked like in the 40s. And I'm not saying that's good, but we made a lot of progress over a long period of time. A lot of progress. We had a black mayor, not a black mayor, a black sheriff in Duval County ran against 2 able white guys. One of them was going to survive. He beat both whites in a runoff. We've had a black president. We've made an enormous progress. But we don't talk about progress. We talk about, are you in this yellow camp or black camp or white camp or Christian camp or Jewish camp? I've had Jewish friends, black friends, white friends all my life. I enjoy all of them. And I don't know why we have to do this stupid stuff. The fair to all in place of Pollyanna. It's just bullshit to me. I'm sick of it. Why don't we just accept people as human beings and quit trying to separate everybody? I think the Democratic Party has led an effort consistently in the last 60 years to divide people. Doesn't work.
Hey, Forrest, we agree.
There's another curriculum out there that might be closer to your heart called the Hillsdale curriculum. How many of you here are familiar with Hillsdale? And would you be surprised that they have diversity training guidelines? Because the Democratic left has forced the whole world into accepting the concept of separation, and so Hillsdale is...
I don't think Hillsdale feels forced about anything.
Say it again.
I don't think Hillsdale feels forced about anything. They take no federal funding because of it.
But they do have a program, a curriculum that they recommend for schools, whether they feel forced to do that or not. My point being that whether it's in the left, the far left, or the right, or the middle, the issue seems to be one that people want to talk about today. And I think there are two reasons for that. And they're not just that the press or the left keeps raising the issue, although I will totally agree that not enough is said about the progress. And I've talked about this before in this class. I mean, I worked in civil rights from the time it wasn't an issue. When I went to school, coming from Idaho, I had never met a Jewish person. I'd met maybe one, I'd never met a black person. I'd heard about black people, but that's it. And so when I arrived in the East in school, it was just a shock to me that the issues I cared about, which were mostly agricultural and extending electricity, were not hot issues in Massachusetts. But when I learned about it, I did get involved and stayed involved for years, and it's been a part of my activity for that whole period of time. And I think the progress we've made is under acknowledged and under recognized. So I completely agree with you there. The thing that vexes me, and it goes back to what Parvez Ahmed said, and I know a lot of people here were troubled by what he said, but the first part of his presentation, how many of you here heard Parvez Ahmed speak? I know Forrest, many of you who were here. Parvez Ahmed, I may cautiously invite again. Can I just finish this one comment, John, and then I'll call on you.
Take two if you like.
He started with a series of data points and says, and they had on the board or on his slides, information about equity in housing, equity in income, equity in wealth, equity in education, and all of those different metrics. And there were many more than that, even health, longevity. 40 years after the civil rights bonanza of the 60s, we essentially eliminated most surviving elements of Jim Crow with the 1964, 1965, and 1967 Civil Rights Act. 40 years on from there, the data shows that black populations are down here against white populations up here. And you stop and you say, why is that? Is it because there's a biological deficiency among black people? They're just not smart. They just don't work. Is that it? Are we really thinking that? Or is there something else going on? Charter gets to speak, or John gets to speak first for it. Is there something else going on? And that's the reason I come back to this issue. The reason we talk about diversity training and all this stuff today is not just some left-wing BS. It's that huge gap. How can that still exist 40 years on? John?
Well, I think the other question is, why is it more of a problem now than it seemed a few years ago? Like Forrest, I grew up in the South, and I lived with it, and I hated aspects of it, and I began to understand some of it, but never all of it. But what I saw growing up was that the people who were most racist were the people who competed most with the blacks. As long as they were competing well, there's no problem. The is a problem when they lose their competitive edge. And I think what it looks like to me, and it may be simplistic, is that now we have a lot of people in this country who for the first time see their competitive edge fading away because of the improving status that Forrest has pointed out. There's been a lot of improvement. Well, that improvement is good for some of us, but it's not good for some people, or at least they think it's not good. This is my view. And as long as we have a big population who grew up with their only competitive edge being their color, then we're going to have a problem with color.
I think you hit upon, it's very well stated, I think you hit upon something else that's going on. And why are we caring about it so much more today than we did, say, 15 years ago? I believe that the steady flat curve or sloping downward curve of all the metrics for white people as well as black people in this country over the last 40 years, while at the same time, this is the curve for the tiny minority at the top. And frankly, most of us are in that tiny minority. We're not billionaires, but relative to all the median income, most people can't afford to come to Vickers. We're in the top 10% or whatever the percentage is. But that puts a huge population at the bottom going down. And as they go down or stay flat, among other things, they look for scapegoats. One of the scapegoats, obviously, black people are taking my jobs. I frankly think more Mexicans and Asians are taking jobs than black people. But that's a whole other data point, another discussion. But there's no question, if you look at the data, that the flat level or declining level of wealth and income among the whole population is a real issue. What to do about it? Is it just race, or is it something else in the economy that's causing this flat curve? Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah.
Louise? No, it wasn't Louise. Somebody else had their hand up a second ago. Good, thanks. Hang on.
I just wondered when things changed a lot. I know that our son, in the 70s in high school, in the early 80s in college, had black friends, and they came home, John, with one of the students when he was at Williams, and in high school they came and joined us at the lake. So I wondered when our other generation changed, not our generation, and I wondered if anybody had any thoughts on that.
The generation, our children and our children's children.
As opposed to when we were growing up.
One of the interesting questions I'm asking, and it goes back again to what I was saying in response to John, I don't think, I could be totally wrong, I don't think our class, and I hate to use that concept, but I will, is any more racist today than we ever were, and I don't think we ever were. I think as a general rule, educated people are pretty racially fair and balanced, as a general rule. There may be things we do. Nancy?
Education is the key, though.
Yeah.
Very important, education.
And so let me rephrase that. It's not so much at wealth level, but it's an education level. College graduates and beyond are probably much less racist than high school dropouts. And again, it goes back to who's competing for your job, John's point, high school dropouts. It's who's worried about whether they're going to continue to have a house. Does that make any sense for us?
I think a lot of what
You're going over time.
Bob asked you to talk to.
No, I-
Bob, I think that a lot of things that have been said that I completely agree and identify with. And I think a lot of what John said, I think is just right on. But I think there's an issue that persists over my lifetime and may continue another 100 years or so. I'm not 100 yet, but I feel like there are cultural issues that separate us also, and we don't ever talk about them. But I feel like some cultures Asian culture particularly have an entrepreneurial bent to them, in my view. And I've been to Asia and seen some of it up close, but I feel like that, I don't know whether you believe the term, and I can't even pronounce it probably, but karetsu, which is a Korean term. A lot of those families came to the LA in that area, and 10 or 15 of them would live in a small home, and then save enough money to put one up in business. And then the obligation of the group was to go out and do it again and again and again. And they created everything from fruit stands to you name it. But I don't see in the black community that same spirit of entrepreneurship. And the truth is, most of us have an entrepreneur, in this room, have an entrepreneurial spirit of some sort. However it was manifested, because we're not in the 10% of the U.S. population. We're a much lower percentage, probably in the 1 or 2%, I guess is my bet. But I think we don't talk about what it takes to create wealth, to create educational opportunities and all the opportunities in the world. It takes money. And there's a lot of money available for people that will try. But you gotta try. And there are many people, Bob Johnson, Black Entertainment Television, is a very successful billionaire black man in America.
The interesting thing to me, and you look at, I don't know how many of you have spent much time in San Francisco. Are there many here, show of hands? The ownership of real estate in San Francisco over the last 50 years has swung so far toward the Chinese, it's mind-boggling. They're so entrepreneurial. And again, I hate to class a group by its race, but you look at the number of convenience stores, gas stations that are run profitably by Asians. You don't see a lot of them run by black people. Why? You don't see a lot of them run by poor white trash either, by the way. You know? That's true. So what is it? And again, should it matter to us? And that's one of the other issues that has something to do with this whole topic. Should we care? Louise?
I'm a person of stories. And you all know about sports in the United States. Well, there's a lot of similarities. Sports is sports. And I'm sure you've all heard of Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson went through a mighty tough time. Consequently, Jackie Robinson was a very bad-tempered man. Very talented. And he and my husband were often together for various reasons. So here's what brought them together. They were sitting out on a baseball field, and Bowie is sitting next to Jackie. And Jackie says to Bowie, "Ma, you got big feet." And Bowie says, "Yes, I do." Jackie says, "What size shoe do you wear?" Bowie says, "I wear a 15.
Oh my God.
Jackie says, "Well, I wear a 15 too." They became instant friends that day. Jackie's bad temper disappeared. Bowie and Jackie got along like a house of fire. What I'm saying by that, sports, baseball, there are a ton of black ball players. Have been ever since Jackie. The black ones and the white ones get along just fine, primarily, because it's their talent. It's the talent you've got, whether you're black, white, pink, green, doesn't matter. And if you got big feet, more's the better. So, anyway, things bring people
The
together.
Bigfoot theory of racial differences. That's great. You know, I find it interesting when I watch football, to watch where the players go when the defense or offense changes sides. And I find it amazing how the blacks congregate and the whites congregate. There's not as much togetherness there as I would have expected. I don't know what that is about. I'm sure they don't do a seating chart based on color. But I don't know if you've all noticed that too. You know, this issue are racial differences, what are those racial differences? Are they genetic? Is there a genetic, biological difference between Asians and whites? that we don't have as much entrepreneurial energy as they do? I mean, I personally, all of my training says absolutely not. There's just no biological difference between black, white, green, yellow, red. John, you're the doctor here. There are other doctors.
Well, it has been shown for a while. Somebody came out with the information that the capacity of the skull was smaller in black people. That's clearly been disproven many times. And when you see the achievement, the increasing achievement of black people, then you certainly begin to get the idea that there's no real holdback except the past. I think when you start in the hole, you've got more to gain in altitude. So no, I don't think there is. I have watched medical trainees, black and white, and I've seen some pretty awful residents who were white, probably more than I have seen who were black. So my own personal opinion from what I've seen medically between the races is there's no real basic difference that explains the differences that we're worried about.
Charlie? And then we'll go to Joan. Charlie first.
This is an interesting issue that we're bringing up at this point as to what differences are there, whether it's mentally or physically. There was a book written about this a number of years ago. I forget the name of it right now. But it was basically about different physical features between the races. And they used sports as the analogy or the point that they were making, in that certain races were better equipped to do certain things physically than others.
You mean they use their size 15 foot differently than
Well, you probably, in the NBA, the National Basketball Association, I believe the number of blacks in that is about 86% of the total number of players. I don't know whether that has to do with the size 15 shoe or not. The big hands. But there's certain qualities in basketball, or the ability to, as I say, white man can't jump. So in baseball, it's about 75%. So, you say, well, okay, there's differences, but there are differences at this level. People making millions of dollars a year, millions. So, where do we go from there?
Joan?
Well, I found in my experience in education, because I was in education all my life, that I saw that there was people of certain socioeconomic groups seem to stay together. That was more a thing than anything, I thought. Because I saw these boys and girls, they got together, who looked the same as far as their clothes, and their intelligence, of course, and their talents. So I don't, that's what I have to say about that. But I also agree with Sue when she said a lot of the books are written for white kids. There are no black kids in the covers, or at least when I was in education. Maybe there are now. But I think that is a drawback also for the black children and for the white children, because when you see them, the black and white in print together, in pictures together, I think that says something to children.
Don?
If we go way back, the anthropologists tell us we all came from Africa. That's where we got to start. But it seems to me ingrained in people, in the subspecies Homo sapiens, is an inherent an inherent capacity to categorize things, people being just one. And we do that. This person is white, this person is black, this person's male, this person's female, this person's from Ireland, this person's from someplace else. They speak different languages, and we categorize people that way, almost automatically as we just look at it. We don't think about that exactly, but it's going on in our minds. We're separating people. And so this concept of trying to teach people to do something that seems to me is inherent in their basic physiology, or whatever you call it, is good in terms of trying to get people to accept the fact that they have this whole problem.
It's interesting that how can you teach traits? And I think the evidence, the teachers here can probably say this, the evidence is pretty clear that you can teach many of the qualities that are required for success. I mean, clearly, when we say, as Nancy was saying, that it's an educational difference, most college graduates have a different view of many of these issues than high school dropouts. It's not just an additional 5 years of age, it's that they studied something. They're learning something. They're learning about each other. They're learning about life differently. So clearly, to me, if education works, then more education is a good thing, and it might help change some of what's going on. So rather than talking about racial differences, should we be talking more about educational level differences and what we can do to improve the education at the bottom of the stack? And that challenge, by the way, let's talk about why is it such an issue today? Clearly, the George Floyd killing, which led to the Black Lives Matter marches, has something to do with the urgency, the reason that so many diversity programs were begun. I think in many schools they existed prior to 2020, but not long prior. And the acceleration of the issue, the increased attention. One of the things I was going to say about the books you read, how many of you noticed content of television advertising in the last year?
Incredible.
It's amazing. I mean, you see, not only do you see a lot more black people, you see a lot more mixed race couples, which is just bizarre. But I mean, think 10 years ago, it wouldn't have happened. You know, and it's almost, or magazines, Sally Ann reads some of these Vogue and other magazines that are filled with black models. Isn't that right? Charlie?
I noticed that also from the advertising, incredible growth in the number of black people getting the opportunity to be in those, which I think is great. I applaud that. These scenes in which they have the blacks and whites doing things together, I think maybe that's a little overstated. I'm not sure that's realistic. But nevertheless, an effort is being made there to even things out.
I think it really does. It changes our perception of what's acceptable. You know, and it maybe will change less than younger people, but I think if you see it for 50 years, it becomes far more acceptable than you've ever seen it before in your life. Carol, and then we'll go over here to Neil. You had your hand up twice, Neil, and I'm sorry.
I kept thinking about, after you were talking about the N-word, and I want to give 2 examples of, because it made me all of a sudden start thinking about turning the tables. When one of our daughters, or both of our daughters, were cheerleaders at Bowles, a darling little black girl was walking beside my daughter, and a black boy yelled out, "Hey, honky, hey, chocolate drop, what you doing with that honky?" And then one day, I came home, and I was in the car, unloading in the garage, and I heard our black yard man speaking to our housekeeper, "Hey, the honky's home." And I just thought, wonder if they're being taught that like we wouldn't think of saying, we call it the N-word, we won't even say the word. Well, do they say, oh, the H word now rather than calling us honky? I mean, I want to turn the tables. What are they being taught about getting along?
There's no question in my mind that the attitude about race is as difficult in the black community as in the white community. Whether it's their saying we're all honkies or whatever it might be. Diversity training isn't just for white people. And all of the diversity training experts say that. It's as much for the black people as it is for the white people. And it's more than just, okay, now, I'm sorry, Neil, go. You've been on for...
I have a personal experience, and I'm not sure, and a number of people have mentioned personal experiences. In a way, I feel lucky, because I went to high school. I went to a high school in...
Hold it for him, Jeannie.
I went to a high school in New York City. It was a Catholic high school. I started in 1944, 45, graduated in 49. Over 50% of the students were black. The number of students that went to college from that high school was close to 80%. It is now close to 90%, and the number of students in that high school that are black are 90%. That's what I was exposed to. And when I talk to the black friends, they would say, my mom got me here, and I'm gonna succeed.
Thank you. That's powerful.
Yeah, hold on just a second.
You know, I think that again, it goes back to what Nancy said, the experience of those with education makes all the difference. Shirley?
I would like to suggest that everyone get out of mostly white Montreal Beach and take a walk in town center and see the mixture of races and people walking together, people with their children, and Muslims, people in hijabs, etc. Walk around. Some of you are from New York City and metropolitan areas, and I can't believe that you actually think this is not happening in advertising and in real life. What is shown in advertising happens in real life if you move out of our privileged little area here.
Of course. That's totally true. I was wondering, in terms of the level of education here, one of my thoughts, and those educators will be speaking to us over the next 3 weeks to dig into this further, is that two things have caused an increase, particularly in Florida, but an increase generally in homeschooling. Clearly COVID. And the idea that people had to be at home, mothers had to stay at home to teach them. Homeschooling just boomed over the last 3 years. But if you try to take away the impact of COVID, this is in 2016 clearly is before COVID, the percentage of students in the United States that are in private schools relative to public schools stayed the same between 1999 and 2016. That surprised me. I would have thought more private schools. Probably the better data would be 1953, the year before Brown versus Board, and 10 years later. That was the flight from public schools to private schools and academies primarily. I was interested that homeschooling nationally has increased only 1% in that 17-year period. But look at Florida. We're 11% of our state population is homeschooled. That surprises the dickens out of me. And you add that to the, let's call it roughly 10% in private schools, that would leave, say, but these numbers, by the way, don't sum to 100, which troubles me when I look at these kinds of charts, but this is what I found online. I find interesting this difference between assigned and chosen. Assigned schools basically are just geographically allocated schools. That's where your neighborhood is, you go. Chosen are the magnet schools. And magnet and charter schools have increased in number and quality, I think, enormously over the last several years. What do these different lower levels of education have to do with the ultimate educational level and thus their attitudes about race? Or thus their attitudes about success or failure in our system? Who controls education? Oh, I'm sorry, Joan, you had another comment?
Yes, it's interesting about the homeschool situation. my great-grandchildren have been homeschooled. And it goes against my grain, because I'm a public school person. But they're homeschooled because of their religion. They're strict Christian, Protestant, Episcopalian religion. And that's why they homeschool them.
There's another person I'd like to
That's the
have
reason
speak
they
to us.
donate.
I'm sorry.
That's the reason I say for their homeschool, why they homeschool.
One of the people I'm going to ask to come speak to us is a young woman named Suzanne Schubel. Thank you. Somewhere around, she's married, who was homeschooled for the last 6 years of her life. She's now running a orphanage in Ethiopia. Keep looking at my memory over here. Running an orphanage in Ethiopia. She can make a presentation that'll blow your socks off. I'll let her do that. But one of the clearest examples of an enormous success in homeschooling. I think she finished college in 2 years after being homeschooled all those years. Who controls education?
Go on with that.
Yeah. There's a question asked earlier. Who makes these decisions about content, curriculum content?
No, I'm just saying, I think this gets back to the question of who determines what the curriculum is.
Whether it's Pollyanna or Fair or Hillsdale or whatever. I think it's interesting for us to learn more about the role of the teachers' unions. They clearly have a large impact on curriculum. I don't think they originated, but I'll bet they are the source of support and funding for some of the groups that find it. Jim?
Good morning. I'm glad we got back on education. I thought we were going to talk about the Great Parent Revolt of 2021, and we've been talking about other things.
Well, it's kind of in the bottom here, but clearly that is an issue. Why are they revolting and what success are they having?
Yeah, and furthermore, the question of who controls education, I think that's central to what the topic is about here. And I can recall when my children were in school, they went to a public school in a very well-developed educational system in Wilmette, Illinois. And there, the school administration was so strong, they didn't even want to talk to the parents. They said, if you wanted to talk to the school administration, they'd say, oh, talk to us through the PTA. Now there's a bad idea. And I guess ever since then, I thought to myself, well, who does control school education? We then sent our children to two of the three to private school after that experience.
And I think that's one of the reasons I put the slide up about the percentage of the population in private schools versus public. And it was surprised that it still stays around 9 or 10%. But I put here on the board some options for who's in charge, who's dictating the level of education. I think the teachers have a strong role, but then you go to the 3 levels of real control who make the decisions, whether it's decision to support the teachers' ideas or modify them. Local boards of education, state boards of education, and of course we'll have Gary Chartrand here to talk more about that. Dictates from the U.S. Department of Education. Is it coming from a central governmental control? Is it 50 levels of governmental control? Or the local level of control? Where are the decisions made? Parents through PTA or parents in open revolt, not members of PTA. But one of the answers, and you hear it all the time, run for the school board. Get on the school board. Exert your influence, like Mark and like Catherine. Yes.
Yeah, I just have one more comment. I'm behind on my comment. Want to make it up. So, I think an answer to all of this, and I'm confused as to which happens at what level, but fundamentally I think that educators ought to control curriculum.
Who should?
Educators should control curriculum because they're the ones that are supposed to know how everything fits together and what you do in secondary school fits into what you're going to do in college and what you do in secondary and college fits into what you're going to be doing in life. However, I don't think parents parent should control curriculum at any level, but I do think parents should have veto power.
Veto power in the form of taking our kids out of school?
Well, that's a different story. Veto within the context of public school, I think parents should have veto power over what is put into the curriculum.
But how do they exert that control if not through the school board?
Well, I think we should have a parent's Bill of Rights. And I think in that Bill of Rights, they should be given that capability and you know, then you get into what proportion, you know, what does it take over to veto something? And I would suggest if a third of the parents don't think something should be taught in their school, then they should have veto power over it not being taught. For the other third, their rights, if they have a different opinion, if it's less than a third, they have the right of going to a different school. So I'm into the couponing idea, whereas a public school student can carry a coupon to a private school and apply that to education elsewhere.
We know we have a Florida tax credit here, which is essentially a coupon. We've run out of time now, and I want to do something now that I suggest we might do at all meetings going forward. Nancy, do you have one last short comment?
Well, comment is that Florida uses the county system of education, it's county-based, and Massachusetts uses towns, small, town-based, school boards, that type of thing. So it's different from state to state.
Our local school board is county? It's not. See, I find that bizarre. That's not a very local level. Joan?
St. John's County, Duval.
Fran, please sit down just for a second. It's
I
important.
just want to say one thing, that the U.S. government, or the U.S. Educational Department, makes the rules for handicapped children that are to be, that all states must apply for. I must act.
Yeah. Good for you. This will now be a tradition in all of our meetings, and it's suggested by Ken Gorman. So all together now.